First off, I'm gonna put my Patreon information up here in the chat. Second of all, I'm going to make a note that to anybody that is watching this, I am going to be, as a preface, I am actually banned from Twitter for half a day because they felt that one of my posts that was mentioning mental health issues with with transgender was considered as hate speech. They felt that that was on the line of hate speech and banning and against their conduct, so they banned me for about half a day. They initially said it was only supposed to be 4 hours, but I guess they changed their minds after I went with their idea and deleted the post. So since they did, so since I essentially went along with what they asked for, they essentially said, you know what, we're just going to change our minds and add more time. So instead of just 4 hours, they're going to make it 11 and a half hours. Which is obviously lovely because that's one of the two major resources that I use to share all of my content. So now if you want any of my content, it's going to have to be up on my Facebook page. And if you look at Joe Singer's podcast, if you search that on Facebook, you will be able to see all of my content there that I will post for those who want another access to it. But otherwise, you're just going to have to get it here at YouTube. That's going to be the problem with that, so I have no other ability to share it outside of those two references. Otherwise, I'll actually just be sharing direct links on Facebook itself for those who use Facebook. For those who just use Twitter, sorry to tell you, but I can't share anything out for the next half day. And that's just the way things go because, as we'll discuss in this post here, is they had this idea of censorship. And we can say things about Facebook a lot, but they are a lot more mild when it comes to censorship than when it comes to Twitter. Twitter seems to be real aggressive on this. When it comes to censorship, they tend to police things a lot heavier than I think Facebook does. On a lot of regular users, they will tend to be very aggressive. On Facebook, if you tend to validate your things on facts, they tend to leave you alone. And they will tend to deem it as not being hate speech. Twitter, you can use the moment that you tend to use anything. Because my tweet was concerning this transgender is mental health issue by using the evidence of the linkage to the suicide rate. And previous to a lot of the politicization of the issue by a lot of these alternate lifestyle political activist groups, the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association deemed transgender as an actual mental health issue. And it wasn't until they got harassed that they actually changed it over. But even to this day, we have many doctors and many psychiatrists and psychologists that to this day actually stand by the original assessment. It's a mental health issue, because if you look at the data, it doesn't support anything else. If it was a biological issue, it would not, such as bisexual, gay or lesbian, it would not, you would not see the suicide rates being basically 9.5 times that of anything else. And this is just complete and utter logic. And this is why when it comes down to it, when you start, this is why Facebook will be less likely to censor you on this when you start putting that logical approach, which I really do appreciate in Facebook. Now, there's certain things on Facebook I do not appreciate, but when it comes down to it, at least they will not ban you for putting for if you put together a logical approach to an argument, they will at least leave you alone on those standards to which they would normally put together on hate speech normally if you just made the statement in general. But when it comes to Twitter, they will tend to basically uh, smack you down when it comes to it, regardless. And this was actually a post. It was actually a response on on an argument that was actually from basically a group of people that would have 100% agreed with me. And meanwhile, uh, this means that it would have been solely from the actual censors up at Twitter, and that would have been the only group that would have actually have seen it, because I believe I did not put any hashtags on it, which means the only group that would have seen it would have been the actual people that have gone through the post, which means either A, the actual people at Twitter, or B, the actual people on the post. The people on the post, it was actually through Lionel Media. People that post on Lionel Media are usually tend to be very, very open-minded and tend to be very, very factually based. And if you make a factual argument, they're not going to attack you. They tend to be from all walks of life and all political persuasions, but they do not get persuaded by this argument of feelings over fact. If you provide a factual argument, they're not going to attack you. Now, when it comes down to what we have for what they've done, is essentially, when we view this, is the idea of social media. Social media should essentially be ignoring the idea of hate speech, because essentially hate speech is just, we want to protect your feelings over facts. And this is essentially a very dangerous idea. Let's take the idea of, it doesn't matter if we're talking religion, it doesn't matter if we're talking the idea of, we can be talking religion, we can be talking the idea of that of fat acceptance, or we can talk the idea of, when it comes down to it, the transgender issue. I mean, but when it comes down to it, is sometimes people need to start hearing the idea of facts, and you'll sometimes get people who ignore that. I mean, if you look at historically on like the Middle Eastern religions, everything that derives out of it. Well, technically Christianity, it's sort of derived out of it, but not really, because when you look at the foundation of Christianity, the actual true foundation of its actual, the actual real true original foundation, it actually technically comes out of Rome. But the actual real true, actual real true foundation of the system of the religions of the Middle East are actually, when you go back to it, it would go down to Judaism and Islam. And when you look at those, when you look at their actual books, is they're quite violent. So when you try to bring these up, it tends to be, it tends to spark a lot of reactions with people. And sometimes people will say with it, oh, there's no difference. There's a huge difference between uh, Judaism and Islam. If you look at the books, well, not really. When you look at them, I mean, look at the story of David. He lopped off a person's head and basically collected people's foreskins. I mean, are you really saying that's really better than what they were portraying in the Quran? I mean, this is kind of some sick stuff. They were portraying a lot of and they were saying, oh, but there's incest. Well, you look at in the Bible, there's plenty of incest as well, and when it goes down back and forth, it's basically, and this is the Old Testament we're talking about, which is the book of the Jews. That's essentially uh, their book, and it boils down to it. And when we look at it, is we need to understand these things, and essentially, this is something that Twitter tends to not like when you tend to bring it up. Now, sometimes you can get around it if you tend to go around verses, and you could tend to get around that point. But when you tend to do it, they tend to kind of watch you a little heavier when you start to do this. Even if you bring up these points, they don't like that because they want to stay. The idea is to stay non-controversial when it comes to Twitter, and they don't want their essential thing is don't uh, don't hurt anybody's feelings because they put feelings over rational argument. And this is the whole point that needs to end. The idea should be we should get to the point of rational argument over everything else. When you look at that's why when you compare the New Testament beyond the things that happen in Revelations, which essentially is supposed to take place in the future, uh, we're talking that the New Testament, which is the essential book of Christianity, you're talking that it's completely different from the book of the other two religions, and you're not seeing these horrible acts take place beyond the crucifixion of Jesus. I mean that's about the worst thing that happens. And if you look at the characters that were embraced in the actual books for the Christian, the actual people that were embraced for the Christians, next to the people that were embraced for the Jews, next to Islam, and you can see a clear difference from these people, and you can see one person was essentially a bad leader being with Moses. I mean, he essentially took him out of slavery. I mean, and essentially it's a people that, if you look at them, they weren't even thinking about the repercussions of what would have happened with that. And then you have the other one, major one would have been David, which was essentially a sadistic leader. And if you look at him, and then when uh, then when you go with Muhammad with Islam, I mean, there's plenty of stuff on him that makes him as a horrible leader himself for what sadistic things he did. And he's really pretty much same lines as David, just in kind of there's certain things that he didn't do that David did that he did that David didn't do, and they're pretty much on the same lines. But they're kind of just as sick individuals that if they existed today, they would basically be put behind padded walls. One engaged in basically pedophilia and rape and beheading people, while the other one engaged in beheading people and removing people's foreskins. I mean, basically, one of them seems to be more in the idea of probably closer to like an honest tool being Muhammad, and from one end, and the other one seems to be more like in the idea of maybe like Ed Gein from David. I mean, those are the closest people, and those people are basically considered probably some of the craziest people we've ever had in the United States in history. And yet they're praised by their actual religions, respectively. And when we get to the idea of this idea of hate speech, I mean, hate speech is completely irrelevant. I mean, we cannot say that it is an actual relevant idea. We look at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court does not even recognize that term. If hate speech actually existed, I think we can determine that the Supreme Court would actually recognize that this has actually been brought forth. Does hate speech exist? And they've actually dismissed the actual notion, and actually pretty astoundingly they've dismissed it, which means what they're actually judging social media by is actually something completely irrelevant. So when it comes down to it, is they're essentially judging it by something that's is completely irrelevant on what can actually happen. And that this is something that is just the case. And it needs to be understood. And when we look at some of these things, I think it also goes down to the cornerstone of their ideology at Twitter as well, is we're seeing people that are decidingly, if not left wing, we're talking almost socialist when it comes down to it, because of the way they run their government, or their body there of decision makers. And when we see that, it's gets to the point where they're actually making decisions that are completely irrational to what the foundation of the ideas of liberty and freedom are. So this is why when we see the actual we see them using an unconstitutional term of hate speech uh, being applied to content violations. We see the I mean, we're seeing that we're seeing that they're basically not essentially defending what the digital age social media should be, which is basically they should be defending the idea of basically being the new public square, and that's the whole thing that they should be, and they should be defending free speech at the last, basically, as far as they can do it. Now, what should be the actual code of conduct is basically is what we have here as criminal conduct, and it's really easy to do, and that's all they have to basically do. And it shouldn't be anything with, oh, this hurts someone's feelings. Well, sorry, dude, but get over it. I'm sorry, but just get over it. That's the end of it. When we see facts out there, if someone's citing facts, we should not even care about what's going on, because the fact is we need rational arguments out there. You're not going to get anywhere for a solution of anything if you start spitting out uh, this idea of fat acceptance. Well, fat acceptance leads to a bunch of dead people. You get a worse problem when you do that. You get liver failure when you do that. That's what happens. People go, "Oh, but I have a perfect heart rate with it." Well, have you checked your liver? No. Well, you're probably going to die because of it. And this is what fat acceptance does, because your liver, there's basically, when we look at the actual percentage of people with fatty liver disease within many cities, it could be as high as like between 30 to 50%. And that's horrible in the Americas. If not, you can go to other countries, and this is what's happening. And it's not from drinking, it's from the actual diet. And the fact is when people have these horrible diets and eating fast food, and basically when you have all this fat coming into the system, that's basically several times what they should have ingested into the system, the body's going to essentially break down, and you're going to get fatty liver disease, or at least a precursor thereof. And there's different medications that can cause this as well. And if you're lucky, I got to the point to where a medication caused a precursor with it, and I was able to kind of like reverse the point. But there's a lot of people that's are not going to be lucky, and they're going to have cirrhosis of the liver and die just because of fat acceptance. Somebody kept telling them a bunch of BS. Oh, don't worry with it. All body sizes are beautiful. Just keep living your lifestyle as you want. Boom, you're dead. And you're going to die by liver failure by the age of 40 or 45. Yeah, guess what? That's what's going to happen. And it's because they were worried on social media about hurt feelings. And this is what happens. Or when it comes down to it, people say about the transgender issue, like what people went after me about, and I basically, or actually I should say not people, but actually Twitter, what Twitter went after me, because that was the only people who did, and it's basically I stated the facts. Is there's a high suicide rate from this. This is not from bullying. This is purely from them questioning their own decisions. And this is what happens. This is why we have this situation. It's not biological, it's actually a mental health issue that's being ignored. Someone breaks a leg. It's not a life choice. It's a broken leg. You need to actually cure mental health issues. I personally have OCD. That's actually the initial medication I was taking was sertraline. That's actually what led to the liver issue. And because I was on a high amount of it, that's actually what ended up causing it. And that's where I was at. Sertraline is also known as what do you call it? As Zoloft. Now they blame Zoloft for a lot of different things with it, which are not factual. But it's what it called. But you need to understand with it is at high amounts with it can cause damage. And you do need to and then if you're on higher amounts, you do need to get things like your liver checked out, just like many other medications. And there's other things such as vitamin D that should be checked out as well for people to stay healthy. And when you start to state these things, is people start to put their feelings above actual facts, and they start to say, "Oh, that's hate speech." Well, just because you don't want to hear facts and rational arguments does not mean it's hate speech. And this is what we've gotten to today. And we've got to people basically, instead of the old, I'm going to put my fingers in my ear, they start screaming hate speech. This is like that's, I don't even know the name of the person, but she got nicknamed Trigglypuff because she got triggered over this basically person who pretty much is a candidate for liver failure within about 20 years. She got triggered on basically facts, so she started screaming at a Steven Crowder event. It was, I think, Steven Crowder, Milo Yiannopoulos, and I forgot the other one. It was a feminist who used to be part of the left wing, but she's kind of pretty much ditched that. I forgot her name. But she ended up getting triggered at this one event. I think it's out in Boston. It was out in Boston, and she started screaming about hate speech. Now this is a person that basically is, I mean, she's going to be a candidate for liver failure, and it's this is the new thing of I don't want to hear what you have to say with it. So instead of just putting your fingers in your ears like they used to do, which at least would go, uh, at least it was dealing with things in a little more polite way. Now they what it called. Now they start screaming at you, and basically they claim everything is hate speech. Hate to tell you, it's not hate speech. It's actually just telling you the facts, and people don't want to hear the facts, so they start screaming at you like banshees, and they go at you like a freaking mob, and they claim that the one person that said the facts is the what it called is the one bullying, and they claim the mob is not bullying, which is they've got things in complete reverse. It's the mob that's the one doing the bullying, and it's the actual. And I've actually received that one when I've actually been on the receiving end of the bullying from the mob on Twitter, because you'll find these bullying mobs, but they're never the ones who are bullying. They're just the ones trying to what it called stop hate speech. And it doesn't matter what it was actually a benign comment that I made there. And you have people saying that that's hate speech. And it's completely irrational when it comes to people on social media. And it's all from the same people, and then when it comes down from Twitter, it's the same like-minded people. They don't want free speech. I mean, you had a article on um I forgot who it was on who posted it but they were what it called they were saying that some people shouldn't have free speech with it. It was actually posted by Matt Kibbe a while back. And I'll see if I can find it so I can get the actual name of the article. Because, and so I can get the actual quote. So, oh, here it is. It's from Titania McGrath. She's a radical intersectionalist, vegan activist, feminist, slam poet, and author of Woke, A Guide to Social Justice. She goes, I am deeply concerned that free speech extremists will find a way to prevent the state from monitoring what people say and think. We need to ensure that the police can arrest those who digress from woke ideas in order to prevent the rise of fascism. This is a quote that Matt Kibbe pulled from her piece on spectator.us. He pulled it on March 4th. Now, when you go to that, this is basically exactly what we're talking about from these people. I mean, this is the type of people that we're dealing with when it comes down to it. Is you have people say that some people should not have the uh, right to free speech. They're calling them free speech extremists. There's no such thing as a free speech extremist. Hate to tell you that one. Either you have free speech or you don't with it. There's no such thing as a free speech extremist. These are these people that basically they don't want to have their feelings hurt from actual facts. And when I'm talking about rational arguments with it, this is what needs to happen. You're going to have morons out there who are going to have their arguments defeated by a rational argument. And the fact is, this is where they don't want to. They don't want when they don't want to actually deal with this. The moment you get a rational argument, they know that they can actually can have their rational argument, their feeling-based argument defeated, and they don't want this. You'll have their feelings-based arguments will happen when it comes down to intervention in other lands. With it, you'll still be able to defeat neoconservatives. You'll be able to defeat these basically these fascists on the left that are trying to say that call you free speech extremists. They're basically just into basically stealing, basically wanting to limit the idea of who can say what. And this is the whole idea, and this is what Twitter's essentially embracing. And they want to basically say who can say what. Well, I think we need to come to a point to where these people need, Twitter needs to essentially, if they're going to take essentially benefits from the government, just like every other social media company does out there, every other major one, I think we need to come to a point to where we need to state that if they're going to essentially take benefits through cooperation with the civilian intelligence, we need to essentially make them actually follow the actual Constitution when it comes down to their code of conduct. And their code of conduct should actually follow the Constitution as written in a very, very strict manner. And we don't need an actual digital Bill of Rights. We just need them to we just need to assert any contractor that any person that actually deals with the government, doesn't matter if they're if they're handing over data or whatever, that they actually deal in such a way that they're actually that their terms and service are equal to that of the actual United States Constitution. And if they aren't with it, they will lose that ability. And trust me, when it comes down to it, is they gain a lot of money and they gain a lot of benefits from that. And this even includes a lot of tax breaks. And if without this would essentially crush most of these companies. And if you look at people like Facebook, if you look at people like Twitter, Instagram, if you look at some of these other ones out there, you'll see that basically they would be financially crushed if you started removing these things. I mean, they couldn't financially hold themselves up without this, because they're essentially government subsidized when it comes down to it. And they know that they couldn't uphold themselves without this, because they know the reason why they have advertisers is because they know that the government is holding them up, and that multiple governments are holding them up. So the United States government said, we're going to pull out if you do not keep your standard within our government. They're going to they would essentially have a massive problem when it comes to advertisements. Same thing when it comes to Google. Right here with YouTube, I guarantee you Google would have a massive problem with their censorship problem. I mean, they're in certain ways they're just as bad. They have their problems just as much. But I think Twitter is probably the bottom of the barrel when it comes to censorship. They freak out over nothing. And people go, oh, but they were the last to ban Alex Jones. Well, the fact is they the way they did it was essentially they didn't even find a real violation. They actually dealt with Oliver Darcy, and Oliver Darcy was just tattling on everybody who he didn't like. And they'd say, okay, he tattled on this person, ban. He tattled on this person, ban. He tattled on this person, ban. And you have what it calls, and then they'll basically say, okay, this conservative or libertarian person said something negative about this liberal person. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to ban them with it. Oh, but this liberal person said give a death threat to a conservative person. Nope, not even going to not even going to strike their account or make them delete the tweet. Well, this means that there's a double standard. How can you actually send death threats to such people as the president, which would essentially be a serious charge? they could be the president, it could be congressional members. How can you send death threats, or even commentators? How can you send death threats to people and it not be an actual violation? They go, oh, no, no, it's not a violation. Is that because of their actual political beliefs? Is that because they support this idea of hate speech? Well, if they support that idea with it, then it looks like you're arbitrarily enforcing your actual code, and that's the whole idea of this code of conduct. And that's where this whole thing comes in, as we're finding that they're arbitrarily enforcing it, and that's what needs to end with it. They're creating this system to where it's arbitrarily enforced, to where it's basically they're trying to create a system to where certain people gets a slap on the wrist, or their comments get ignored for basically being complete and utter being hateful and sometimes even criminal, uh, which would essentially be which would essentially should be a in their conduct code, because the way they should conduct a conduct code is basically when they're engaging in libel, slander, direct threats of violence, display of acts of violence they themselves are committing, which is essentially, as we're talking about as you'll see in the actual description, which is an actual evidence of criminal conduct, and but they'll take those and they'll ignore those. But when we actually see this idea of hate speech or bullying, unless we're talking about a single person, we're talking about a single person here. It could be going on the idea of libel or slander, but if we're not talking about a single person, if we're talking in the general sense, it should be ignored. Anything in the general sense should be basically ignored. There should be nothing on the idea of this whole thing, because it doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense when it comes down to it, because that's why their things applied in an arbitrary manner. I mean, we're talking that this is basically a system to where they want to basically apply it in an arbitrary manner, so that they have this system that they can't even so that they can basically shut down people with opposing views. And this is really what it's about. Now if we go into the idea of, is this a smart business model? No, they're not. They're really, since they have this government backing, they're really not as concerned about it being a smart business model, because they figure that they're not going to be shut down or removed or anything, because they have this essential government backing, which is going to assure them of advertisements, because essentially they know that nothing else is going to help come through, because there's this idea that there's someone that's propping them up, and we have a group that's propping them up. Same thing with Facebook and these other ones that are essentially being propped up by the government. It means that basically that they know that they can keep up with its conduct. Now, if the government were just all of a sudden say, to keep up with this government relationship, you must be consistent with the United States Constitution, all of a sudden with it, you're going to see them have to make a tight decision. A, split with the government, or B, they're going to have to drop that idea of hate speech, because they know that it would not be consistent with the Constitution, because as the Supreme Court stated, that it is not a constitutional word. I mean, they don't even validate it. Now they could still use these things for overseas and other areas such as the EU, which uses these brain dead terms, in which they could do that. But when it comes down to it, anybody from the United States they couldn't touch, which might actually propel a lot of conservatives in other nations to proclaim that they're from the United States, even though they aren't, just to assert an address there, just for that sole purpose, which would be quite interesting for them to state that I'm from the U.S. because they can't tell if you're from the U.S. or not. I mean, unless you actually give an actual phone number, they can't tell where you're from, and that's really one of the interesting things. And then that would basically apply to people out of Europe and certain people out of Asia. They'll state that they're from the United States so that they can get full access to content. And for those other people with it, they can that are from other free areas, they would just say that they're from their own country. But this would essentially ensure that they could actually post as they wish. Because we need at least a better standard. I mean, they at least need to raise the standard of what at least Facebook is. I mean, at least Facebook allows you to post things out there, and if you validate it with an actual factual point, and at least show that you're pointing out something that they're not, and it's not just directly targeting a group, like making a blanket statement that would be basically saying like you hate the group, as some supremacy group would do. They pretty much leave you alone. They don't lock your account. The only way they lock your account is if you're tweeting too often, or I should say posting too often when it comes to Facebook, or sending out too many friend requests. That's the only way they really tend to block out your account. But when it comes down to they will they'll block out your account. They'll say, you committed this violation of hate speech. Well, it's not hate speech because it was not stated in malice. And and essentially you're targeting people that are stating facts that are never meant in malice, and that's what you're doing. And it's basically what needs to be understood is they don't need to be protecting feelings. They need to just basically let these things go through and let people just speak freely. And what ends up happening is essentially what they're trying to do is, I think, is they're trying to create the lowest common denominator of all of their countries that they deal with. And I think this is why they're creating this system like this, so they can make it easiest for all of their consumers. So they only have to create one system, and they don't have to create multiple systems for their users, which saves them money. Instead of actually standing up for freedom of speech, they'd rather just basically go with the lowest common denominator, being what China's system is, and restricting freedom of speech. They feel that that's the best way, and they can basically do this idea of making it sound cool by attaching the ideas of these words that sound cool for those who actually embrace freedom of speech, by stating that anybody who states rational arguments as hate speech, and those who those who actually embrace restrictions on freedom of speech as woke, and those who basically have the idea to who actually embrace unbridled freedom of speech as free speech extremists. So they sound like this basically hate. So they sound like this this large hate group and supremacist group, even though they're the complete opposite. And the actual real hate group is actually the ones that want to actually take away people's freedom of speech. And I think this is what they're trying to do, so they can paint it so that it makes business operations much easier for them. And but if they were actually had a pair of cojones, they would actually go through and actually say, what we're going to do is we're going to actually stand up for people's rights and deal with the actual issue and eliminate this fake idea of hate speech. And we're basically going to embrace the idea of people speaking their mind and letting all of these ideas come through, letting the best idea win, and pushing forth the ideas of going toward rational arguments, making sure that those who are trying to make emotional arguments are pushed to the wayside, and it's you're only left with the most rational argument, and the most rational argument wins. And this should be the ideal point. This is how we actually created the Constitution. The Constitution was created because the people with the most rational argument won. And this should be the actual point. The people making the emotional argument should never be allowed to win, because those arguments are all irrational. This is why we get these ideas of free speech extremists and hate speech, and then we get the ideas of humanitarian wars, humanitarian intervention. When it comes down to those people, we get the ideas of liberating people. We get the ideas of spreading democracy. These are these other ideas when it comes to the neocons. We get these ideas of basically income equality when it comes down to these socialists, and it's all basically these feeling-based arguments. None of them are based in a rational-based argument. They're all based on feelings. Now, if you get to a rational-based argument, none of these would ever survive, because they would all die within minutes. But when we allow for people to say, "Oh, that's hate speech and that's unpatriotic to speak that way," and "Oh, you can't speak that way against that country because that's anti-Semitic, or that's Islamophobic, or whatever word you want to attach to it," this is where you get to this, and they claim that is hate speech. And this is where you get to that point. And this is why we want to essentially kill all types of ideas of censorship. Let people state what they want to state. Let the most rational argument win. And it's just pure logic. The only content that should ever be removed are those which is criminal conduct. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. But apparently we have morons running Twitter. And I think Jack Dorsey is moron number one. And especially when he wants to play the idiot and act like, "Oh, I don't know how these people got banned." Well, frankly, if a person has over 1 million followers, you know why they got banned. And frankly, you're just basically lying to people when you state that. And we know that you're lying to people because the fact is, you don't want to confess up to the truth that basically he got tattled on by Oliver Darcy. And Darcy's number one tattletale when it comes down to it, because he wants to make sure that CNN looks legitimate, and he wants to essentially take out all of his competitors online. And he knows when there's competitors online that it makes it very difficult for him to actually compete. Now, if you like this, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share us on Twitter, as I can't. Make sure to share us on all other forms of social media. And I will see you guys later with a podcast. that again I cannot share on Twitter because it will not be late enough. I can't share anything until like basically tomorrow because it's too late. So basically that's about it. And make sure if you can donate to my Patreon, and that's about it. Bye everyone.